The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that wrapped around the walls like an invisible force, thick and stifling. Judge Harrison sat high above the room, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood of his bench. The smirk on his face was one of pure amusement, a cruel glint in his eyes as he studied the woman standing before him. She was smaller than he expected. Modestly dressed, her posture steady, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Too calm, too composed, but that only made it funnier to him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, tilting his head as if examining a peculiar little creature that had wandered into his courtroom by mistake. "You really think you can argue the law against me?" His voice was thick with condescension, dragging the words out like they were a joke, meant for his personal entertainment. "A war veteran, huh? And now you're here what? Playing lawyer?" A ripple of soft laughter moved through the courtroom, a few amused chuckles from the gallery. Clara Mitchell didn't react. She didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't show even the slightest hint that his words had touched her. Harrison shook his head, his smirk widening. "You people always think you can outsmart the system," he mused, his voice laced with mock disappointment. "But the truth is, you wouldn't know the law if it was printed on the side of a cereal box." More laughter. A few heads nodding along in agreement. Clara's eyes remained locked on the judge, pale blue, sharp, unwavering. She let the room fill with its own arrogance, let the judge bask in the warmth of his own self-importance. And then finally, she spoke. "I understand it just fine, Your Honor." Her voice was steady, cool, cutting through the room like a knife through silk. "And in about 5 minutes, when I'm done, you're going to regret every word you just said." The laughter stopped. Just like that, the atmosphere shifted. The courtroom air grew tight, like a string pulled just to the edge of snapping. Judge Harrison's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he caught himself. And then, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom flew open with a bang. A man in a sharp suit stormed in, his face pale, almost ghostly, as if he had seen something that had shaken him to the core. He clutched a thick folder in his hands, moving with urgency as he whispered something to the bailiff. Judge Harrison's amusement flickered. Confusion settled into the deep creases of his face, and for the first time since Clara had entered the room, something else slipped into his expression. Something dangerously close to fear. The sun hung high over Rivermont, casting a golden hue over the quiet little town. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. And Clara Mitchell liked it that way. She had spent years avoiding attention, choosing to blend into the background, keeping to herself. No uniforms, no ranks, no courtrooms. Just a quiet life. She volunteered at the community center, ran errands, kept her head down. But trouble had a way of finding people who knew how to fight it. She had only been inside the grocery store for a few minutes when she heard the shouting. At first, she ignored it. People argued all the time in public places, frustrated customers, short-tempered employees. But then she heard it again. A different voice this time. Young. Panicked. "Let me go! I didn't do anything!" Clara turned toward the front of the store, her eyes narrowing. Near the registers, a teenage boy, no older than 16, was struggling against the iron grip of a security guard. The kid's hoodie was bunched up around his shoulders, his face flushed with panic as he twisted in the guard's grasp. The guard was big, heavy-set, his face red with anger as he yanked the boy's arm tighter. "You think you can just steal and walk out of here? We don't tolerate thieves." "I didn't steal." The boy's voice cracked with desperation. "I was just looking at it, I swear." The words pulled something deep inside Clara, something she hadn't felt in a long time. That familiar sting of injustice, of being unheard, of knowing the truth, but not having anyone believe it. She took a step forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "What exactly happened here?" The security guard turned, giving her a dismissive glance before scoffing. "Stay out of this, lady. I caught this punk trying to pocket a candy bar." Clara's gaze flicked to the boy. "Is that true?" He shook his head furiously. "No! I was holding it, but I put it back. I didn't take anything." She exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. Then, she turned back to the guard. "Do you have security footage?" The man blinked. "What?" She repeated, slower this time. "Security footage. If he really stole something, there should be footage of it." A flicker of hesitation crossed the guard's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Clara knew that look. He had nothing. "Listen," she said, keeping her tone measured. "If the kid did something wrong, take him to the proper authorities. But if you're just assuming he stole because of the way he looks..." She let her eyes drop briefly to the boy's worn sneakers, his tattered hoodie. "Then you're making a mistake." The guard's jaw clenched, but he hesitated. The weight of the moment hung between them. Then, with a huff, he let go of the boy's arm. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back. "But if I see you near that shelf again, you're out." The boy rubbed his wrist, his breath shaky, his eyes flickering toward Clara. "Gratitude." He mumbled a quick, "Thank you," before bolting out the door. Clara turned back to her cart, shaking her head. It was nothing, a small act of fairness in a world that rarely played fair. She had no idea she had just set something in motion. Later that evening, she placed her grocery bags on the kitchen counter, relishing the quiet of her small home. But something felt off. A nagging unease settled in her chest, though she couldn't quite place why. It wasn't until she turned on the news that she understood. The screen flickered to life, and there, staring back at her, was a familiar face. The teenage boy from the store. "Local youth arrested," the news anchor reported. Authorities claim he has been involved in multiple shoplifting incidents. Some witnesses argue the arrest may have been based on a misunderstanding. Clara's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. And deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Clara stood at the defense table, her hands resting calmly in front of her. Across from her, the prosecutor, James Calloway, adjusted his tie with a slow, deliberate smirk. He had seen self-represented defendants before, overconfident, unprepared, naive. But this? A war veteran playing lawyer? He cleared his throat, stepping forward with exaggerated confidence, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone in the courtroom to take in the absurdity of it all. "So, Miss Mitchell," he drawled, emphasizing her name like a schoolteacher addressing a particularly slow student. "You believe you can defend this case against the city's prosecution without any formal legal training." A ripple of soft laughter rolled through the courtroom. Calloway let it linger, turning his gaze to the judge for support. Judge Harrison didn't laugh, but his smirk deepened as he tapped his gavel lightly against the wood. "For the record, Miss Mitchell," Harrison said, leaning forward with a casual air, "this court does not recommend self-representation, especially for someone with no legal background." He let the words hang in the air, his smirk widening. "You do understand the consequences of losing this case, correct?" Clara remained still, her expression unreadable. Then, she gave a single, measured nod. "I understand." The judge sighed, shaking his head like a parent humoring a child's bad decision. Veterans, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the audience to hear. They think, just because they survived a battlefield, they can survive anything. The courtroom erupted in laughter. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Clara didn't flinch. She let them enjoy their moment. She let them believe they had already won. Then Calloway straightened his papers with a dramatic flourish. "Your Honor, the defendant," he gestured to Ethan Davis, the nervous teenager sitting beside Clara, "was caught red-handed shoplifting from a local store. We have multiple eyewitnesses, and security footage shows him loitering near the candy aisle. He was apprehended by security before leaving the store, but the intent was clear." Calloway turned back to Clara, his smirk sharp, expectant. "Now, Miss Mitchell," he said, clasping his hands together, "since you're so eager to play lawyer, why don't you enlighten us with your legal defense?" Clara exhaled slowly. Then she finally moved. Reaching down, she picked up a thick black binder from the table. It was heavier than it looked. Purposefully so. She lifted it, let the weight of it settle in her hands. Then, thud. She dropped it onto the table with a force that echoed through the courtroom. The sound cut through the air like a gunshot. Calloway's smirk faltered. Judge Harrison arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly is that?" Clara's voice was steady. "Evidence." A murmur spread through the audience. The judge's smirk twitched, ever so slightly. Calloway frowned. "Evidence," the prosecutor repeated, forcing a chuckle. "And what evidence could you possibly have that contradicts the store's footage?" Clara flipped open the binder, pulling out a printed image. Without a word, she stepped forward and handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Harrison's gaze dropped to the paper. The second his eyes scanned the contents, his entire expression shifted. The amusement was gone. Calloway noticed. "Your Honor?" he asked, his tone losing its previous confidence. The judge didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly over the edges of the document. Calloway frowned and turned toward Clara. "What is that?" Clara met his gaze, calm as ever. "The original store footage." A collective gasp spread through the room. Calloway's smirk was gone now. That's not possible. The footage we received clearly shows nothing," Clara interrupted, her voice slicing through his sentence like a blade. "Because the footage you received was altered." Silence. Calloway stammered, flipping through his own documents as if they might suddenly contain an answer. His hands were shaking. "Objection," he blurted. "That's a baseless claim." Clara reached into the binder and pulled out another paper. "This," she said, handing it to the bailiff, "is a sworn affidavit from a former employee of the store. She testifies that management routinely edits footage before handing it over to authorities, in order to make it seem like certain individuals are guilty." Judge Harrison's mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. Calloway's face paled. I wasn't made aware of this," he stammered. Clara tilted her head. "That's because you didn't look." Silence. Judge Harrison exhaled sharply, then turned toward Calloway. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice dangerously measured, "do you care to explain why the footage presented by the prosecution does not match the footage Miss Mitchell has obtained?" Calloway opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your Honor, I need to verify this footage. We can't just then verify it," Clara said simply. "Call the store. Ask for the original footage." The judge nodded. "Agreed. We will take a brief recess while we verify this evidence." The gavel slammed down. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Clara wasn't listening. She wasn't done yet. She turned toward Calloway. Her pale blue eyes locked onto his, sharp as steel. "I'd suggest you start preparing a new case," she said quietly. "Because if I'm right, the real criminals aren't sitting at this table." Calloway swallowed hard. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, Clara could see it. The fear creeping into their eyes. The courtroom was still humming with tension when the bailiff re-entered, a thick manila folder clutched tightly in his hands. His movements were stiff, careful, as if he knew the weight of what he was carrying. He crossed the room in silence, stopping at the judge's bench before leaning in and whispering something. Judge Harrison frowned. His gaze flickered to the folder, then back to the bailiff. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before finally taking it, his fingers tightening around the edges. Clara watched him, calm and unmoving. She had seen that look before, hesitation, doubt, the subtle crack in a man's confidence when he realized he might have underestimated his opponent. The judge flipped open the file. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His face, once so smug, shifted, his smirk flattening, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Mitchell," he said, slowly, his tone noticeably different from before. "It seems there are a few details about you that were not disclosed to this court." Calloway, still visibly rattled from their last exchange, straightened in his chair. "What details?" Judge Harrison didn't answer immediately. He lifted the file slightly, tilting it toward the prosecutor. Calloway leaned in, eyes darting over the contents. The color drained from his face. Clara remained still. The judge shut the folder with a soft snap. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his gaze pinning her like a hawk. "You've been involved in multiple legal proceedings, Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice laced with something sharp. "Quite extensive ones, actually. Military trials, high-profile cases, and, unless this file is mistaken," he tapped a finger against the folder, "formal legal training." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Calloway sat up straighter. His shock quickly twisted into something else. Anger. "Your Honor," he snapped, "this woman misrepresented herself to this court. She led us to believe she had no formal legal experience." Clara lifted her chin slightly. "I never said I didn't." Calloway's nostrils flared. "That's deception." "It's omission," Clara corrected smoothly. Her voice was level, unwavering. "And last I checked, omission isn't a crime." The room was deathly silent. Judge Harrison exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "So, let me get this straight," he muttered, mostly to himself. "This entire time, you had formal legal training, and you let us believe you were an amateur." Clara tilted her head, a small, knowing smile ghosting at the corners of her lips. "I let you believe whatever you wanted to believe." For the first time since the trial began, the judge's composure cracked. His eyes twitched, just for a second, before he masked it again. Calloway, however, wasn't as controlled. He shot out of his chair, his hand slamming onto the desk. "Your Honor, she cannot be allowed to continue representing this defendant." Clara arched an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Calloway hesitated, just for a second, but the judge picked up his momentum. "On procedural grounds," Harrison said, his voice clipped, almost hurried. "This court has an obligation to ensure all legal representatives are in compliance with judicial standards. Given the new information regarding your background, your standing will need to be reevaluated before you can proceed." Clara narrowed her eyes slightly. "You're removing me from the case." Judge Harrison's expression was stone cold. "Effective immediately." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Ethan, sitting beside her, went rigid. His eyes darted between her and the judge, panic creeping into his face. "What does that mean?" he whispered. Clara didn't respond, because she knew exactly what it meant. It meant they were scared. It meant she had gotten too close. And it meant that someone higher up, had just decided she was too much of a problem to keep around. Calloway settled back into his seat, a slow, victorious smirk spreading across his face. Judge Harrison lifted his gavel. "This case will be put on hold until Mr. Davis secures new legal representation." Clara's hands curled into fists beneath the table. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected them to move this fast. Bang! The gavel struck the wood. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. Ethan turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "Clara, what do we do?" She rose to her feet, exhaling slowly. "We don't panic." Her voice was calm, but inside, her mind was already racing. This wasn't just about a teenage boy on trial anymore. This was about a system that was protecting itself. And if they were willing to go this far to stop her, it meant she was dangerously close to the truth. The knock came just after midnight. Clara had been sitting in the dim light of her living room, a glass of water untouched on the table beside her, her mind still turning over the events of the day. Being removed from the case had been a calculated move, a desperate attempt to shut her down. But desperation meant fear, and fear meant she was on the right track. She wasn't sure what her next move was yet. Then, 3 sharp raps against the door. Her body tensed instinctively. No one came to her house this late. No one even knew where she lived. She rose quietly, reaching for the small pistol she kept in the drawer near the couch, just in case. Approaching the door, she peered through the peephole. "Ethan." She exhaled, unlocking the door and pulling it open. He stood on her porch, his hoodie pulled up, shifting from foot to foot, like he was trying to disappear into himself. His hands were stuffed deep in his pockets, his face pale. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Ethan glanced over his shoulder before stepping closer. I needed to talk to you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in?" She studied him for a second, then stepped aside. "Make it quick." Ethan slipped inside, his movements jittery, anxious. He barely gave the living room a glance before turning back to her, his hands still buried in his pockets. "I found something," he said. "Or, I think it found me." She frowned. "What does that mean?" Ethan hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. A crumpled piece of paper, slightly torn at the edges. He handed it to her without a word. Clara unfolded it. Her breath stilled. It was a list, a long one. Dozens of names handwritten, some crossed out. But her focus went straight to the bottom. Ethan Davis, circled in red ink. Her grip tightened. "Where did you get this?" Ethan swallowed hard. "My brother." Clara's head snapped up. "Your brother?" Ethan nodded, his eyes dark, unreadable. "He used to work for them?" Her pulse quickened. She had assumed corruption, bribery, case manipulation. But this? A list? Names crossed out? She looked at Ethan. "What is this?" Ethan hesitated. I think it's a kill list." Silence. It was the way he said it. Flat. Certain. Like someone who had already made peace with the worst possibility. Clara inhaled slowly, willing her pulse to slow. She needed more information. "Where is he now?" "Your brother?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. He left town months ago. But before he did, he told me that if anything weird ever happened, if I ever felt like I was being watched, I should check the old safe in our house." His eyes flicked to the list. This was inside. Clara's mind was already moving. The implications of this were bigger than anything she had expected. If Ethan's name was on that list, It meant someone wanted him gone, someone powerful. Before she could say anything else, something changed in the air. A shift, a feeling, a car engine outside, a presence. Her instinct screamed just a split second before, crack. The window shattered. "Get down!" Clara lunged, grabbing Ethan and dragging him to the floor as shards of glass exploded across the room. A bullet embedded itself into the wall inches from where they had been standing. Her gun was in her hand before she even had time to think. She pulled Ethan behind the couch, pressing herself against the floor as she listened. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Ethan was shaking, his breath coming too fast. "They found me," he whispered. Clara peeked over the edge of the couch, eyes narrowing toward the window. The night was still, but she knew someone was out there. They weren't here to scare them. They were here to eliminate them. She looked at Ethan, her voice low, steady. "Listen to me. When I say run, you run." Ethan's eyes widened. "Run where?" Clara's fingers tightened around the grip of her pistol. "Anywhere but here." Another gunshot. No more time. She turned, aimed, and fired. The night was thick with the smell of gunpowder and shattered glass. Clara's ears were still ringing from the last shot as she crouched low, pressing Ethan against the floor. They had seconds, maybe less. Her grip on the pistol was steady. Her heartbeat wasn't. Outside, the crunch of boots against gravel sent ice through her veins. The men weren't running. They weren't afraid. They were hunting. She glanced at Ethan, his breath shallow, his hands clenched into fists. "When I say go," she whispered, "run." Ethan swallowed hard, but he nodded. Clara shifted, peering over the couch just enough to see the movement in the darkness. Shadows flickered near the broken window. 2, maybe 3 figures. Armed, trained, not just hired muscle. Someone had sent professionals. She exhaled slowly. Then she moved. A sharp pivot, her arms snapping up. One shot, bang, a figure dropped. Another, bang. A second stumbled back. Chaos erupted. Ethan bolted toward the back door, feet pounding against the hardwood. Clara followed, gunfire ripping through the walls behind them. They barely made it outside before the night swallowed them whole. A sharp voice shouted in the distance, "Don't lose them!" Clara grabbed Ethan's arm, yanking him down behind a row of trash bins. The alley was dark, damp, the smell of gasoline thick in the air. She could hear them closing in. Too many. No way out. Then, tires screeched. A black car pulled up fast, its headlights flicking off just as the passenger door flew open. "Get in!" Clara didn't hesitate. She shoved Ethan forward, diving into the back seat just as the car peeled away, bullets sparking against the pavement behind them. She turned, heart still hammering, expecting to see a stranger behind the wheel, but instead, Jesse, Ethan's brother. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. "You're welcome," he muttered. Clara exhaled sharply, shoving her gun back into her holster. "How did you know?" Jesse didn't take his eyes off the road. "I didn't. I was watching. You were being followed. Figured I'd stick around." Ethan slumped beside her, chest rising and falling rapidly. "They're trying to kill me," he murmured. Jesse's grip on the wheel tightened. "They will kill you if we don't end this now." Clara leaned forward. "Then tell me everything." Jesse's jaw twitched. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. "They don't just rig cases. They own the system," he said, voice low. "Judges, cops, prosecutors, they're all in on it. They don't just make criminals disappear. They choose who's guilty and who isn't. And if someone gets in their way," he glanced at Ethan, "they take care of it." Clara clenched her jaw. "I need proof," she said. Jesse let out a humorless laugh. "You already have it. That list? It's more than just names." Clara frowned. What do you mean? Jesse pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his jacket, tossing it into her lap. Each name has a date next to it. Clara unfolded it. Her stomach dropped. The names weren't just targets. They were scheduled. Ethan's date, 2 days from now. Clara's fingers curled around the paper. Who's running this? Jesse hesitated. Judge Harrison's high up, but he's not the top. Clara's mind was already spinning. If Harrison wasn't the mastermind, that meant this went even higher, and she needed leverage. She straightened. Get me to Calloway. Jesse shot her a look. Are you insane? Clara's eyes were cold. He knows something, and he's going to tell me. 30 minutes later, Clara kicked open Calloway's office door. The prosecutor barely had time to flinch before she grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against his desk. Tell me everything, she hissed. Calloway's smirk was gone. He looked pale, terrified. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. Clara yanked him closer. Wrong answer. Calloway's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. You don't understand. If I talk, I'm dead. Clara's grip tightened. You're already dead. I'm just giving you a chance to decide who pulls the trigger. He swallowed hard. His hands shook. Then, finally, he cracked. It's bigger than Harrison, he rasped. Bigger than any of us. Clara's jaw clenched. Who? Calloway's lips parted, but before he could speak, the door behind them swung open. Judge Harrison. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his smirk making a slow return. Well, he mused, this is a familiar scene. Clara didn't let go of Calloway. Her pulse pounded, but her face remained unreadable. Harrison took a slow step inside. I should thank you, Mitchell. You're proving just how predictable you really are. Clara's eyes narrowed. The judge tilted his head. You're looking for the top, but here's the thing. You're not going to find them. They don't exist. Not on paper, not in courtrooms. He smiled. They exist in the shadows. And you're just a very, very annoying light. Calloway's breath was shallow beneath Clara's grip. He looked ready to pass out. Harrison exhaled. I'm going to make this easy for you, Mitchell. He took another step closer. Walk away. Clara didn't blink. Harrison's voice softened, almost patronizing. This isn't your fight. You think you know what's at stake, but you don't. So I'll give you one last chance. He leaned in slightly. Drop the case. Leave town. And maybe, just maybe, you get to live long enough to regret ever stepping into my courtroom. Silence. Clara's heartbeat was steady. Harrison smirked. Or don't. And I promise you, Mitchell, your name will be next on that list. For the first time in the entire conversation, Clara smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And then she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, too late. Harrison's smirk twitched. Excuse me? Clara let go of Calloway and stepped back. You should have killed me when you had the chance, she murmured. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't need to hear Harrison's threats, because she had already made her choice. She wasn't walking away. She was going to burn it all down. The city skyline stretched in front of them, lights flickering like tiny warnings in the night. Clara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Ethan sat beside her, still bruised, still shaken, but his eyes held something new, determination. They had come too far to stop now. This is our last shot, Clara murmured. If the Attorney General doesn't act, we'll have no one left to turn to. Ethan exhaled shakily. And if he's like the rest of them? Clara didn't answer. She already knew the truth. They parked outside a towering government building, its glass doors reflecting the dark streets. Clara stepped out first, scanning their surroundings. Nothing seemed off, but that meant nothing. If Harrison had eyes on them, they wouldn't see it coming. Inside, the receptionist barely looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" Clara pulled a flash drive from her pocket and set it on the counter. "Tell the Attorney General that Clara Mitchell is here." The woman hesitated. The name meant something. 15 minutes later, they were inside a sleek, dimly lit office. The Attorney General stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Tall, sharp-eyed. He turned slowly as they entered, studying them with an unreadable expression. "Miss Mitchell," he said, voice smooth. "I was expecting you." Clara stiffened. Ethan shot her a look. She stepped forward, placing the flash drive on his desk. "This is everything," she said, her voice steady. "Bribery, fabricated evidence, murder orders. It all leads back to Judge Harrison." The Attorney General studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up the flash drive, turning it between his fingers. "I see," he murmured. Then he sighed, and slowly unplugged his computer. Ethan inhaled sharply. "You're part of it." The Attorney General didn't even try to deny it. He gave them a small, almost pitying smile. "Miss Mitchell, I don't think you understand how things work." Clara's breath slowed. Ethan took a step back. "We have proof. Proof," the Attorney General repeated with amusement. "You think corruption is brought down by proof?" Clara's jaw clenched. He exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't have power, Miss Mitchell. You have a problem, and I'm afraid I have to solve it." Before she could react, the door behind them burst open. 4 men, suits, no badges, no hesitation. Ethan shouted as rough hands grabbed him, dragging him backward. Clara lunged, too late. Something hard struck her skull. The world tilted. Then, darkness. A harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Clara's head throbbed as she came to, her wrists tied behind her back, ankles bound. She was sitting in a warehouse, the cold cement biting through her clothes. She inhaled sharply, forcing her eyes open. Ethan was next to her, tied to a chair, his lips split, one eye swollen shut. And in front of them, Judge Harrison. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease, watching her like a cat studying a dying mouse. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Clara exhaled, steadying her breathing. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Harrison chuckled. "Oh, I considered it. But I like watching people understand." He took a slow step forward. "This is where your little crusade ends. No hero speech, no last-minute rescue, just 2 bodies in a river." Ethan shifted beside her, breathing hard. Clara's mind was already racing. There was always a way out, always. She just had to find it. Harrison nodded at one of the men, a gun cocked. "You don't have to do this," Clara said. Harrison smirked. "Yes, I do." A second's pause. Then she moved. In one sharp motion, she kicked her legs up, using the chair's momentum to swing herself backward. The chair shattered against the floor, splintering into pieces. The gun went off. She rolled. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she didn't stop. She grabbed a broken chair leg and swung. Crack! The nearest man went down. Ethan moved, slamming his chair against another attacker. The room exploded into chaos. Clara lunged for the gun, wrestled it from the man's grip. Harrison turned to run. She didn't hesitate. She fired. A single shot. It hit him in the shoulder, sending him crashing against the desk. He gasped, gripping his wound. Clara stepped forward, aiming the gun at his head. "You think this ends with me?" He spat. "You think taking me down will change anything?" She exhaled. Then, sirens. The warehouse doors burst open. FBI, SWAT, agents swarmed in. Clara didn't lower her weapon until they had Harrison on the ground, his wrists cuffed behind his back. Ethan let out a shuddering breath. Harrison was still smiling as they dragged him away. "You'll never win, Mitchell," he called out. "There will always be another one of us." Clara watched him go, then whispered, "Then I'll burn them all down, one by one." 3 weeks later, the world had changed. Judge Harrison was behind bars. Calloway, too. The Attorney General had resigned in disgrace. The corruption that had once ruled the system was crumbling. Ethan was free. Clara stood outside the courthouse, watching as he hugged his mother, their relief palpable. He turned to her. "So what now?" Clara smirked. "You tell me." Ethan exhaled. "I think I want to do what you do." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Fight for people who can't fight for themselves?" Ethan nodded. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then do it right." Ethan grinned. "You sticking around?" Clara glanced at the road stretching ahead. "I think my work here is done." Ethan held out his hand. "Thank you." She shook it. "Stay out of trouble." Then she turned and walked away. The fight was over. For now. If this story gripped you, like, share, and subscribe, because the truth deserves to be told.